believe it is only the first time that David Held is coming to us. It's a scandal, really. As I have known David for as long as I can remember, in his many capacities, a very multifaceted, highly talented intellectual and academic. Well, I have to also admit he is the founder of my distinguished, beautiful, brilliant publishing house, and one of the 3 people who started Politic Press 24 years ago, together with John Thompson and the one and only Anthony Giddens. So there is a long connection that stretches also through the Gutenberg galaxy of doing books together. How many academics do you know that managed to publish as much as Professor Held, run a press, and if I understood things correctly, started a new journal last month? I hope he's taking his vitamins. Professor David Held is the co-director of the Center for Global Governance and a Graham Rolls Professor of Political Science at the LSE. If you don't know what that is, Google it and get yourselves informed just about the greatest social theory school in Europe, probably in the world, I would say. Published extensively around cosmopolitanism, global governance, democracy at the transnational national level, policy, government, social but political theory. And starting from roots really that stretch back to areas that are very relevant to the humanities. David Held has worked with, for many years with Stuart Hall as a man who understands the politics of culture and cultural studies, and that reflects, of course, in his work that combines magnificently political theory, philosophy, with issues of cultural interest. The books are too many, really too many, but the most important in some sort of order. Models of Democracy, Democracy in the Global Order, Global Transformations, and Global Covenant that we are reading tomorrow. One that is very dear to my heart is about 3,000 pages, co-edited with Henrietta Moore, Globalization and Culture. And as I said, really broad appeal, interdisciplinary, an enormous pleasure. I hope it's the first of many visits. And without a microphone on, David Held.
My work over the last few years has been in 2 or 3 different areas. I have worked, if you think of political theory as having at least 3 components, I've tried to work at these different levels. At one level, we might call it sort of normative and conceptual, is concerned with thinking about the primary values and principles with which we operate and work with. A second level of political theory is often concerned with characterizing society as it is, and trying to understand the relationship between values, principles, and social change and social processes. And the third level is about thinking about how we move from where we are, perhaps, to where we might like to get to be, a fuller realization of certain values and principles. And I publish books at each of these different categories, as it were. Books that are concerned with the nature, first and foremost, of ideas and ideals. Books like Democracy and the Global Order is my attempt to really state sort of political philosophy for the age in which we live. Books like Global Transformations are much more about trying to understand how it is and where that we are situated where we are, in what kinds of processes, and what kinds of institutions, and what kind of organizational structures, and so on. And I've written books like Global Covenant, which are much more political, which are much more engagements with the world as we find it, and try and draw on the more normative analysis and the more empirical, but around a particular project. The lecture I'm going to give this afternoon touches on these different components, and I hope it doesn't fall between them, as it were, badly, but it will try and sketch out, in summary, I suppose, my cut at thinking about cosmopolitanism, but not just how I think about cosmopolitanism really, but how I think about how it relates to the politics of our time, and why, you know, to put a point sort of provocatively, I would like to, at least if you remember anything at the end of the afternoon, it might be the line, realism is dead, long live cosmopolitanism, which might be a way of summarizing, polemically albeit, how I think about the relevance of cosmopolitanism in an age in which raison d'etat and the geopolitical pursuit of interests of states no longer provides a means by which we can easily coexist together, let alone resolve pressing transnational, transborder, and global issues. So I want to speak to this big theme, and I will do so really in a number of different parts. But let me just say something about cosmopolitanism by way of an introduction. if this were a movie, this would be a scene that would give you just a little glimmer of what is the action coming later before it gets unpacked in a more sequential order. For me, cosmopolitanism is concerned to disclose the ethical, cultural, and legal basis of political order in a world where political communities and states matter. Of course, political communities and states matter, but not only and exclusively. They're not the only things that matter. They don't matter, as it were. It's exclusion of other things. In the circumstances in which we find ourselves, where the trajectories of each and every country are tightly entwined, we hardly need to mention things like the subprime markets, which most of us have not heard about, or many of you may have heard about 2 years ago, but now everybody knows about something called the subprime markets. We live in a world where risks taken by the Anglo-American financial system have had consequences across the world in a way that is absolutely apparent to everyone reading the newspapers today. So we live in a world where the trajectories of each and every country are tightly entwined. And yet at the same time, we have to realize that the reasons of state, or the partiality, or the reasons of state, or the partiality of reasons of state, needs to be recognized at the same time. So we live in a world where the trajectories of each and every country are highly entwined, I want to suggest, and the partiality of reasons of states needs to be recognized. While states are clearly hugely important vehicles to aid the delivery of effective public regulation, equal liberty, social justice, states cannot be thought of as hermetically sealed or ontologically privileged. They can be judged by how far they deliver public goods and how far they fail. For the history of states is, of course, marked not just by phases of bad leadership, corruption, and so on, but by some of the most brutal episodes. A cosmopolitanism relevant to our global age must take this brutality, among other things, as its starting point, and build ethically and politically sound and robust conception of the proper basis of political communities and of the relations among political communities. So, my lecture today examines why cosmopolitanism remains a compelling political philosophy and approach to global challenges. The first part of it will set out the context of cosmopolitanism. That is what the Rawls would call the context of justice, the context of cosmopolitanism, by which I mean an explanation of why cosmopolitanism, wonderful, thank you, an explanation of why cosmopolitanism is relevant to global political and social problems. Our focus on cosmopolitan values rooted in leading international regimes and organizations. Final section Don't overgeneralize from one time period. Don't overgeneralize from the concepts of one culture, and so on. You can see how you could unpack these things. The key point being that if you overgeneralize from one set of historical moments, you often fail to see important trends, processes, comparative differences, and so on. So it's easy to overstate the moment and to exaggerate from one set of historical experiences. While each of the elements that I mentioned poses a challenge to a rule-based global order, it's a profound mistake to forget that the 20th century established a series of what I call cosmopolitan steps towards the delimitation of the nature and form of the political community, the limitation of sovereignty and the reasons of state. These steps were laid down after the First and Second World Wars, which brought humanity to the edge of the abyss, not just once, not just twice, not China, not Islam, not them, as it were, but us in the driving seat here in Europe. At a time as difficult as the start of the 21st century, it's important to recall why these steps were taken and to remind oneself of their significance. So, from the foundation of the UN system to the EU, from changes to laws of war to the entrenchment of human rights, from the emergence of international environmental regimes to the establishment of the International Criminal Court, people have sought to engage in the reframing of human activity and embedding it in law, rights and responsibilities. Many of these developments were initiated against the backdrop of formidable threats to humankind, above all Nazism, fascism and of course Stalinism. And those involved in them affirmed the importance of universal principles, human rights and the rule of law in the face of strong temptations to simply put up the shutters and defend the position of only some countries and nations. They rejected the view then of national and moral particularists that belonging to a given community limits and determines the moral worth of individuals and the nature of their freedom, and they defended the irreducible moral status of each and every person. At the centre of such thinking is the cosmopolitan view that human well-being is not defined by geographical or cultural locations, that national, ethnic or gendered boundaries should not determine the limits of rights or responsibilities for the satisfaction of human needs, and that all human beings require equal moral respect and concern. The principles of equal respect, equal concern, and the priority of vital needs of all human beings are not principles then of some remote utopia, but they are at the centre of significant post-Second World War legal and political developments. What does cosmopolitanism mean in this context? In the first instance, cosmopolitan refers to those basic values which set down standards or boundaries which no agent, whether a representative or global body, state or civil association, should be able to violate. Focused on the claims of each person as an individual, these values espouse the idea that human beings are in some fundamental sense equal, that they deserve equal political treatment, that is, treatment based upon the equal care and consideration of their agency, irrespective of the community in which they were born or brought up. After 250 years of nationalism, sustained nation-state formation, and seemingly endless conflicts over territory and resources, such values could be thought of as out of place. But such values are already enshrined in the law of war, the human rights law, the statutes of the ICC, among many other international rules and legal arrangements, which can be documented at great length. Second, cosmopolitanism can be taken to refer to those forms of political regulation and lawmaking which create powers, rights and constraints which go beyond the claims of nation-states and which have far-reaching consequences. In principle, the nature and form of political power. These regulatory forms could be found in the domain between national and international law and regulation, the space between domestic law, which regulates the relations between the state and its citizens, and traditional international law, which applies primarily to states and interstate relations. This space is already filled today by a host of regulation, from the legal instruments of the EU and the international human rights regime as a global framework for promoting rights, to the diverse agreements of the arms control system and environmental regimes. Within Europe, the Convention for the Protection of Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms and the EU itself create obviously new institutions and layers of law and moral and political outlook that builds upon the strengths of the post-1945 multilateral order, particularly its commitment to universal values, human rights, and democratic values, and which seeks to specify general principles through which all might act. These principles can be widely shared and form the basis for the protection and nurturing of each person's equal interest in the determination of the forces and institutions which govern their lives. Cosmopolitan values can be expressed formally and in the interest of brevity in terms of a set of principles. Let me state them formally quickly and then explain them more. For me, there are 8 principles which, as it were, specify the contours of a cosmopolitan outlook. These are the principles: 1, the equal worth and dignity of each, equal moral worth and dignity of each and every human being. Principle 2, the idea that human beings are capable of active agencies, capable of choice and reason. 3, that it follows from 1 and 2 that if people pursue choices, they must be responsible and accountable for those choices. If we defend the first 2 principles, the equal moral worth of each and every human being, and the idea of active agency of each and every human being, then we have to also think about the ways in which the choices of some impinge upon the fate of others, responsibility and accountability. So my first principle is equal moral worth. The second, that of active agency. The third, of responsibility and accountability. The fourth is the primary idea of consent in the determination of collective outcomes and collective decision-makings. It's a key vehicle and principle for moving between individual choices about individual forms of action and collective choices which have collective impacts. 5, the simple notion that collective decision-making about public issues is critical. And 6, that these processes should be inclusive and as close as possible to those affected. So principle 4 is simply consent. 5, collective decision-making about public issues. 6, inclusiveness and subsidiarity. Only 2 to go. 7, the avoidance of serious harm. And 8, sustainability. Now, while 8 principles may seem like a daunting number, they are interrelated and together form the basis, I think, of a compelling ethical and political orientation, and orientation which helps illuminate what it is that we have in common despite everything. These 8 principles can be thought of as falling into 3 clusters, which simplifies the matter greatly. The first cluster, principles 1 to 3, sets down the fundamental organizational features of the moral universe, without which we couldn't have the ideas, for instance, of human rights. Its crux is that each person is a subject of equal moral concern, that each person is capable of acting autonomously or self-determiningly with respect to the range of choices before them, and that in deciding how to act or which institutions to create, the claims of each person affected should be taken into account. Personal responsibility means, in this context, that agents and actors have to be aware and accountable for the consequences of their actions, direct or indirect, intended or unintended, upon which may substantially restrict and limit the choices of others. All these 3 principles are the bedrock of the universalist moment, as it were, of the late 19th and 20th century, without which we would not have the regimes that we have. A commitment to the idea of equal moral concern, a commitment to the notion that people are capable of acting autonomously, and a commitment to the idea that the claims of each person need to be taken into account in thinking about which institutions to create and shape. Now, the second cluster of principles, 4 to 6, consent, collective decision-making, inclusiveness, forms the basis of translating individually initiated activity or privately determined activities more broadly into collectively agreed or sanctioned frameworks of action and regulatory regimes. They are underlying principles of democracy. So the first set of principles, the underlying principles of self-determination. The second are the underlying principles of democratic agreement and negotiation and decision-making. Public power can be conceived as legitimate to the degree to which these principles are upheld, and to the extent that they're not upheld, legitimacy of it is called into question. And the final principles, the avoidance of serious harm and sustainability, lay down a framework for prioritizing urgent need and resource conservation. By distinguishing vital from non-vital needs, by distinguishing those things that create serious harm and those that don't, Principle 7 creates an unambiguous starting point and guiding orientations for public decisions. While this prioritizing commitment does not, of course, create a decision procedure to resolve all clashes of priority in politics, it clearly creates a moral framework for focusing public policy on those who are most vulnerable, who would be unable to act autonomously without certain material capacities. And by contrast, the last principle, 8, seeks to set down a prudential orientation to help ensure that public policy is consistent with ecological balances and it does not destroy irreplaceable and non-substitutable resources. To be more concrete. It could be objected at this point, given the plurality of interpretive positions in the contemporary world, which are obvious, social, cultural, religious, and so on, that it's unwise to construct any kind of political standpoint and seek to defend it upon overarching principles. For it's doubtful, the objection will continue, that a bridge can be built. Look at all the diverse forms of political will that we find in the world. How can a bridge be built between many particular wills and a general will? In a world marked by diversity of value orientations, on what grounds, if any, can we suppose that all groups or parties could be argumentatively convinced about fundamental ethical and political principles? Yet I would argue that the principles of cosmopolitanism set out here are the conditions of taking cultural diversity seriously and of building a democratic culture to mediate clashes of the cultural good. They are, in short, the conditions of just difference and the conditions of democratic dialogue. The aim of cosmopolitanism, thus understood, is the conceptualization and generation of the necessary background conditions for a common or basic structure of individual, social, and political activity. Thus, while modern cosmopolitanism acknowledges a plurality of values and a diversity of moral conceptions of the good, how could it be otherwise? It entails, as one commentator aptly put it, a particular type of political arrangement, one which, for one, allows the pursuit of different conceptions of the good. Only polities that acknowledge the equal status of all persons, that seek neutrality or impartiality with respect to a wide range of choices of personal ends, hopes and aspirations, and that pursue the public justification of social and economic arrangements, can ensure a basic or common structure of political action which allows individuals to pursue their projects, both individual and collective, as free and equal agents. Hence, cosmopolitanism and cosmopolitan principles are the principles of a democratic public culture, stripped of one crucial assumption, never really justified in any case in liberal democratic theory, classic or contemporary, that these principles can only be effectively enacted within a single, circumscribed, delimited, territorially based political community. Part 3. The idea of cosmopolitan law invokes the notion of a domain of law different in kind from the law of states and the laws made between one state and another for the mutual enhancement of geopolitical interests. Kant, the leading interpreter of the idea of such a law, interpreted it as the basis for articulating the equal moral status of persons in what he called the universal community. For Kant, cosmopolitan law is neither a fantastic nor a utopian way of conceiving of law, but a necessary complement to the laws, to the codes of national and international law, and a means to transform them into the public law of humanity. Now, while Kant limited the form and scope of cosmopolitan law to the conditions of universal hospitality, what he called the right to present oneself and be heard within and across communities, a very fundamental right, by the way, because when Kant develops this notion of universal hospitality, the right to ask for a dialogue, the right to present oneself and be heard in dialogue with others, distinguishing this from the claims of imperial right at the time, which was so prevalent, in which imperial powers and colonial powers went to other parts of the world, discovered them in inverted commas, thought they liked them, decided to keep them. So he was drawing a sharp distinction between a right which he felt initiates dialogue and one which underpins the claims of coercive power. Now, Kant limited the form and scope of cosmopolitan law then to the conditions of universal hospitality. I understand cosmopolitan law here more broadly as the appropriate mode of representing the equal moral standing of all human beings, their entitlement to equal freedom and to forms of governance founded on deliberation and dissent and consent. In other words, cosmopolitan law should be thought of as that form of law which best articulates and entrenches the 8 principles of cosmopolitan order. If these principles are to be systematically entrenched as the foundation of law, the conditions of democratic cosmopolitan regulation of public life could initially be set down. In this conception, the nation-state withers away. But this is not to suggest that states and national democracies become redundant. Of course not. Rather, states would no longer be regarded as the sole centres of legitimate power within their borders, as is already the case in diverse settings. You can be a citizen of Glasgow and vote in city elections, the same person is a citizen of Scotland and votes in Scottish elections, the same person is a citizen of the UK and votes in the UK elections, and the same person holds European citizenship rights. 4 overlapping forms of citizenship: city-based, regional-based, national-based, and European-wide based. 4 overlapping forms of citizenship principles embedded at different levels of political association. All, in some senses, in a way, unanticipated by many classical forms of political theory and ways of thinking about democracy. But in my argument, right to authority or sovereignty can be stripped away from the ideas of simple fixed borders and territories and thought of as in principle an attribute of basic cosmopolitan democratic law which can be drawn upon and enacted in diverse settings, from local associations to cities to states to supranational regions and beyond. After all, what is at the heart of the crisis about financial institutions is that the decision-making structure of these institutions has largely been the preserve of a small number of powers who've taken decisions about risk for the world, but actually without engaging in a dialogue and deliberative process with all those constituencies. The decision-making structures of the IMF, the World Bank, the Basel Committee, and so on and so forth, all of them are highly restricted forms of clubs in which decision-making is taken about risks. These are undemocratic clubs in their deep and fundamental core, which have taken decisions about risks for everyone, but only on the basis of a small, narrow reflection on one set of interests, namely their own. At the heart of the cosmopolitan conception of global order is the idea that citizenship can be based not on exclusive membership of a territorial community, but on general principles which can be entrenched and drawn upon in different settings. The meaning of citizenship thus shifts from membership in a community, it's a traditional notion, which bestows for those who qualify particular rights and duties, to an alternative principle of world order in which all persons have equivalent rights and duties in cross-cutting spheres of decision-making which can affect their vital needs and interests. As Habermas has written, only a democratic citizenship that does not close itself off in a particularistic fashion can pave the way for a world citizenship. State citizenship and world citizenship form a continuum whose contours, at least, are already becoming visible. There is only an historically contingent connection between the principles underpinning citizenship and the national community. And it is this connection weakens in a world in which we live in, of overlapping communities of fate. The principles of citizenship need to be re-articulated and re-entrenched. Moreover, in the light of these developments, connection between patriotism and nationalism becomes easier to call into question as well. And a case built to bind patriotism to the defence of core civic and political principles, not to the nation or country for their own sake. What you're defending are these core principles, not, as it were, the blood ties and community bonds of a country for its own sake. If Tony Blair had gone after 9/11 to the United States and said to George Bush, "We support you because what has happened here are a violation of these principles of international law, and insofar as you are concerned to restore these principles of law, we support you," it would have led to a very different qualified alliance than the one that followed, which was exactly the opposite of that, which was "my country right or wrong. Your territory has been violated by an act of violence. We will support you and stand by you shoulder to shoulder. No qualifications, no conditions." Only national identities open to diverse solidarities and shaped by respect for general rules and principles can accommodate themselves successfully to the challenges of the local age. Ultimately, I want to suggest diversity and difference, accountability and political capacity can flourish only in a cosmopolitan legal community. Or to put the point differently, the global challenges we face are better met in a cosmopolitan legal framework. The key reasons of this should be emphasized. First, cosmopolitan values, how I started, have played a constitutive role in the development of important aspects of international and political life. And these continue to be of great relevance in the framing of core general civic and political principles. And the illegitimacy of the war that followed, for example, in Iraq, we can judge illegitimate and illegal precisely because of the significance of these principles. Second, in a world of overlapping communities of fate, with interlocking and interdependent relations across borders and sectors of society, generated by globalization, among other processes, these forces bind the fortunes of people together across countries in dense networks now and dense processes, from environment to finance, and so on. Third, if this complex and demanding set of political issues that arise from these complex interdependencies are to be resolved, not by markets, and not by geopolitical might, the G1, the G2, the G3, the G4, the G5, which G, but by mechanisms of deliberation, accountability, and democracy, then a democratic cosmopolitan legal order could be seen to set down a fair and inclusive political framework to address them internationally and globally. Which brings me to my last section, really, global challenges. Global challenges today can be thought of in terms of at least three types. Those concerned with sharing our planet, global warming, biodiversity, ecosystem losses, water deficits, for start. Then secondly, those concerned with sustaining our life chances, poverty, conflict prevention, global infectious diseases, among other things. And those concerned with managing our rule books, nuclear proliferation, toxic waste disposal, intellectual property rights, genetic research rules, trade rules, finance rules, tax rules, and so on. In an increasingly interconnected world, these global problems cannot be solved by any one nation-state acting alone. Take genetic research rules. One single, which is, maybe the most difficult in some sense to take because it's the least obviously global and international in its form and scope. I mean, things like global warming, climate change, and global infectious diseases clearly have this widespread impact. But say something like genetic research rules, you could have, as in the UK, the tightest principles governing genetic research, which are set down by detailed reflection on the appropriate ethical rules for governing what can and cannot be done in genetic terms, in terms of genetic engineering and genetic manipulation and so on. And in the UK, there was a clear deliberative process about this. Laura O'Neill, a very eminent chair the Royal Commission on these issues, and clear principles were set down in the framework of law to govern to create the ethical framework and legal framework for the governing of research in this area. But even if 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 countries, or 5 countries, or 20 countries have strict rules that match these high standards, if some countries don't, then clearly the genie of genetic research and genetic manipulation is released from the lantern elsewhere. And it's not surprising that some of those countries that have the least, as it were, close connection to the heart of the international community are the ones that are most lax about genetic research rules in this area. For example, you find Israel has very much more loose regulation in this area than the UK. China is another great area where it is perceived that there's huge potential advantage of all kinds, including commercial knowledge, to be gained from being a world leader in this area. And if some countries are willing to loosen the rules, or have minimum rules, or no rules in this area, then no matter how robust the ethically and guided the principles and legal regulation is in the UK and elsewhere, it will not succeed in creating a regulatory framework for others who will then adopt and pursue their research in different sorts of ways, with consequences that will have global reach in the decades to come. In our increasingly interconnected world, many of the global problems that I suggested that I mentioned, cannot be resolved by single nation states acting alone. They call for collective and collaborative action, something that the nations of the world have not been good at, and which they need to be much better at these pressing issues and to be adequately tackled. There are 3 big ones which we can talk about in question time later, if you like, which are climate change, financial market regulation, and nuclear proliferation. And I think that these are the 3 critical test areas upcoming for the future of global politics. We either get deals within these frameworks that work in some collective sense, or basically the multilateral order risks fragmenting and breaking down. While complex global processes from the financial to the ecological clearly connect the fate of communities to each other across the world, global governance capacity at the same time is under pressure and greater pressure. Problem-solving capacities at the global and regional level are weak because a number of structural difficulties which compound the problems of generating and implementing urgent policy with respect to global goods and balance. These difficulties are rooted in the post-war settlement itself and the subsequent development of the multilateral order. Briefly, the problems faced by international agencies and organizations stem from many sources, including the tension between universal values, which I've spoken about and which I will generalize further, and state sovereignty built into them from their beginning. In a way, the 1945 settlement spliced together universal values and political sovereignty in an awkward and contested manner that we live with still today. For many global and political legal developments since 1945, curtail sovereignty, but others support it in distinctive ways. From the UN Charter to the Kyoto Protocol, international agreements often serve to entrench the international power structure, not weaken it. The division of the globe, of course, into powerful nation-states, the 5 of the international, of the Security Council above all, with distinctive sets of geopolitical interests, are embedded in the articles and statutes of leading IGOs like the Security Council, but not just there. Thus the sovereignty of right, thus the sovereign rights of states are often affirmed alongside them more universal principles. Moreover, while a case can be made that universal principles, as I argued, and would argue till the cows come home, as they say, are part of the working creed of officials in many UN agencies, such as the United Nations Children's Fund, UNICEF, UNESCO, the WHO, NGOs such as Amnesty International, Save the Children, Oxfam, they can scarcely be said, of course, to be part of the working creed of many politicians, national or international. In addition, the reach of contemporary regional and international law rarely comes with a commitment to establish institutions with the resources and clout to make declared universal values and rules and objectives effective. The susceptibility of the UN to the agendas of the most powerful states, the G1, whichever, the partiality of many of its enforcement operations, or lack of them altogether, the underfunding of its organizations, the continued dependency of its programs on the financial support of a few major powers are all indicative of the weaknesses, the continued dependencies, rather, of its programs on the powerful few. But there are deeper problems still. Let me highlight 4. A first set of these problems emerges as a result of the development of globalization itself, which generates public policy problems which span the domestic and the foreign, and the interstate order with its clear political boundaries and lines of responsibility. These problems are often insufficiently understood or acted upon, like climate change, for instance. Whose responsibility is it? There's a fundamental, often, lack of ownership of key pressing global issues at the global level itself. A second set of difficulties relates to the inertia found in the system of international agencies, or the inability of many agencies to mount collective problem-solving solutions faced with uncertainty about lines of responsibility, frequent disagreements over objectives, means, and costs. This often leads to a situation where the cost of inaction is greater than the cost of taking action. And it's clearly true in the area of certain global infectious diseases like malaria, where the cost of doing little is vastly greater than, in fact, the cost of actually concentrating resources effectively and dealing with malaria head-on. But it's also likely to be true in the area, of course, of climate change, where the Stern report, among others, clearly shows that the costs of doing nothing will be vastly greater than the cost of taking action. Now, a third set of problems arises because there's no clear division of labour among the myriad of international governmental agencies. Functions often overlap, mandates frequently conflict, and aims and objectives too often get blurred. If you go to any conflict situation or any transition economy, there are so many IGOs and NGOs on the ground, and it is not at all clear which NGOs or INGOs know what is going on. There's no overall coordination, and this is a critical problem in many cases. And the fourth set of difficulty relates to an accountability deficit, itself linked to 2 interrelated problems: the power imbalance among states and those between state and non-state actors in the shaping of global policy. Multilateral bodies need to be fully representative of those whose lives are affected by their decisions, but they rarely are. As I said, one pressing contemporary example of this is clearly global financial institutions, where the World Bank, the IMF, the Basel Committee, and so on, have been taking decisions effectively with global impact, but in small cabals of highly restricted clubs. Underlying these difficulties is a breakdown of symmetry and congruence between decision makers and decision takers. The point has been recently well put by Inga Karl and her associates in their work on global public goods at the UNDP. They speak about the forgotten equivalence principle. That is, that the span of a good's benefits and costs should be matched with the span of jurisdiction in which decisions are taken about that good. At its root, such a principle suggests that those who are profoundly affected by a public good or bad should have a say in its provision or regulation. Precisely the principle that doesn't apply in international financial institutions, for example. Such a principle of equivalence could be circumscribed by a concept of the right of protection from grievous harm. In this way, those to be included all-inclusiveness would entail deliberation and engagement in policies that seriously affect life expectations and chances. If this principle were to be applied in different international organizations, the decision-making membership would look very different in each and every case. All too often, there's a breakdown of equivalence between decision-makers and decision-takers, between decision-makers and stakeholders, and between the inputs and outputs of the decision-making process. Among obvious examples are climate change, or the impact of trade subsidies. It's maybe perfectly rational for the French and others to subsidize their agricultural industries, for the European decisions, democratic decisions, to allow the subsidy of milk farms and livestock farms to the tune of $2 a day, which is, is the highest most towns in Europe enjoy a higher standard of subsidy, a higher standard of living than 48% of the world's population. We may say it's a perfectly rational democratic decision to allow subsidy within a country or even within a region like the European Union. The problem arises, of course, when the decision-making structure produces accountability to one set of decisions, but the impacts are transborder and fundamental on lives of others who are excluded from those decision-making processes. So, climate change, a clear example, trade subsidies, AIDS management, question of intellectual property rights, lots of examples. Thus, the challenge is to find ways to align the circles of those involved in decision-making with a spillover range of the good under question, i.e. to address the issue of accountability gaps, to create new organisational mechanisms for policy innovation across borders, and to find new ways of financing urgent public goods. In short, legitimate political authority at the global level cannot be entrenched adequately without addressing the representative nature of institutions, the organisational and financial gaps in governance arrangements. What speaks to these problems? Realism? No. Cosmopolitanism and cosmopolitan principles point the way forward. To restore symmetry and congruence between decision makers and decision takers requires a reframing of global governance following the cosmopolitan stepping stones of the 20th century. The signals and signs are there to be followed, and to address those challenges generated by cross-border processes and forces. This project must take as its starting point, in other words, the world we live in, a world of overlapping communities of faith, not singular national communities of faith. Recognizing the complex processes of the interconnected world, it ought to view certain issues, such as industrial and commercial strategy or housing and education, as appropriate for spatially delimited political spheres, the city, the region or state, while seeing other big issues such as the environment, pandemics or global financial regulation as requiring new, more extensive institutions to address them. Deliberative and decision-making centres beyond national territories are appropriately situated when the principle of all-inclusiveness can only be properly upheld in a transnational context, when those whose life expectancy and life chances are significantly affected by a public matter constitute a transnational grouping, or when lower levels of decision-making cannot manage satisfactory transnational or global policy questions. Of course, the boundaries demarcating different levels of governance will always be contested, as they are, for instance, in many local, subnational and national polities. Disputes about the appropriate jurisdiction for handling public issues will be complex and intensive, but better complex and intensive in a clear framework in which cosmopolitan law frames political power than abandoned simply to powerful geopolitical interests, dominant states, or market-based organizations to resolve them alone. Accordingly, to return to where we began, states are hugely important vehicles to aid the delivery of effective public regulation, equal liberty, and social justice. They should not be thought of as ontologically privileged. They can be judged by how far they deliver these public goods and how they fail. The same can be said about political agents operating beyond the level of nation-state. They are by no means necessarily noble or wise, and their wisdom and ability depend on recognizing necessary limits on their action, limits which mark out legitimate spaces for others to pursue their vital needs and interests. IGOs, INGOs, like states, need to be bound by a rule-based order which articulates and entrenches cosmopolitan principles. I want to suggest that only such an order can underwrite a political system which upholds the equal moral standing of all human beings and their equal entitlement to liberty to forms of governance founded on deliberation and consent. Here is the basis to build a politically robust and ethically sound conception of the proper basis of political community and of the relations among communities in a global age. We need to build on the cosmopolitan steps of the 20th century, not weaken them, as has been the case in the last decade, if we are to deepen the institutional hold of this agenda. And I would suggest to you, as I have once or twice already, financial crisis is a classic example of the way in which decision-making structures, which have profound global consequences, have been taken by undemocratic small clubs who have managed risk in a way that is narrow, bearing only on what they thought were their interests, misjudged and misconstrued, as it so happens, in the medium and longer term, but without regard for the likely risks and consequences down the line to others. Is it a terrible time to have this kind of agenda and set of arguments? I think actually, surprisingly, it's an opportune moment to rethink the nature and form of contemporary global governance and to have these discussions. The policy packages that largely set the global agenda in recent times in economics and security have failed. The so-called Washington Consensus and Washington Security Doctrines, or market fundamentalism and unilateralism, have dug their own graves. The most successful developing countries in the world, China, India, Vietnam, Uganda among them, are successful because they've not followed the Washington Consensus agenda, and the conflicts that are most successfully being resolved and diffused in the Balkans, among other places, are the ones that have benefited from concentrated multilateral support and the human security agenda, not the unilateral security agenda. Here are clues as to how to proceed. We need to learn to follow these clues and learn from the mistakes of the past if the rule of law, accountability and effectiveness of the multilateral order are to be advanced. In addition, the political tectonic plates appear to be shifting. With the failure of unilateralism in US foreign policy, uncertainty over the role of the EU in global affairs, the crisis of global trade talks, the growing confidence of the so-called BRIC countries, and the unsettled relations with Islam in part and the West, business as usual in the future is highly unlikely at the global level. It's highly improbable that the multilateral order can survive very much longer in its current form. A new political space is being opened up. Of course, this is my final thought, Cosmopolitan has its enemies, many, which can exploit this space. But I want to suggest that cosmopolitanism constitutes the political basis and political philosophy of living in a global age. In a world of overlapping communities of fate, individuals need to be citizens, not just of their immediate political communities, but of the wider regional and global networks which impact upon their lives. Under such conditions, people would come in principle to enjoy multiple citizenships. Political membership is in diverse political communities which significantly affect them. This overlapping cosmopolitan polity would be one that in form and substance that reflected and embraced the diverse forms of power and authority that already operate within and across borders.
The floor to whoever wants to begin with any questions at all, any points.
I just wanted to raise a question on the principles you formulated, particularly the principle of choice and how it relates to the idea of responsibility and accountability. To me, in this day and age, we make choices day by day, trivial in principle, but I have the belief that many choices we are making are choices we make by force. In other words, we're forced to make choices because of what the environment, our society expects from us, etc., etc. So that's one aspect. So our process of individualization is, to speak with that, the process of forced individualization. That's one aspect. The second one is that in our society it's very difficult to pinpoint what exactly the consequences are of decisions we make. We hope to reach certain effects with our decisions, that's why we make them, and we hope to avoid some of them, but we may not be able to know all of them. So we make decisions in an environment or in a stage of uncertainty, so to speak. If that's the case, is it then possible, or how should we then formulate or apply the other principle of accountability and responsibility? How can we hold people, individuals, responsible for their actions, trivial or principled, if they've had to make these decisions coercively, like not completely out of free will, and in the knowledge of uncertainty. So that's one, maybe quite a large question, but I hope you can break it down into digestible parts.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think that it's certainly the case that many of the choices we make are partial choices with limited knowledge, and the choices we make are bounded by at least three things: unacknowledged conditions of action, which are conditions that we bring to bear on our lives, which are only dimly reflected in our consciousness, as it were, limited knowledge, and unintended consequences of action. So, in a sense, I mean, your description that many of our choices are forced, and that our knowledge is limited, often of the consequences of action, seems to me, empirically and theoretically, as it were, correct. The question you're asking, though, is what implications does this have for my understanding of the principles and how you pursue them? I suppose the core issues for me is to distinguish between the principles, as it were, which govern, as it were, the contours of individual life and choice and responsibilities, from collective choice and collective responsibility. What interests me most is when an individual issue becomes, an individual set of choices becomes a public issue, and when collective decision-making creates public issues that need to be bound by principles of accountability. The principles of accountability that I'm most concerned with are principles of democratic accountability, and are the movement between, as it were, the first three principles and the second three principles. Because it's only at that moment when you engage in the collective regulation of social, economic and political life that the question arises: on what basis, on what principles, and under what structures. So for me, I mean, philosophically, there's a lot of interesting questions to be raised about accountability and responsibility of individual choices, but it's the social choices and the structure of social choices that are at the forefront of what I'm thinking about here.
Are you happy with this? So, in between. Okay. I have Marcus and then Marcus.
Yeah. I want as well to ask some questions concerning your 8 principles. I would like to understand a bit more the inner structure of the principles. I have the impression that what you are mentioning here are principles of very different levels, even more levels than you mentioned. If I look at the first 3 principles, I have the impression the first one is a clear normative principle. The second and third are more some kinds like necessary presupposition to have such a cosmopolitanism at all. So the capacity of agency and the accountability of people are presuppositions in order to have moral principles or political principles at all. While the first principle of equal worth of human beings is a clear normative principle. If I see the other principles, I'm wondering how they are interrelating, whether or not you find some kind of priority in it. For example, it's very likely to assume that if we are accepting the idea of consent of collective action and the idea of sustainability, that nearly all political actions we are confronting with are can be constructed in a kind of clash between those principles. So we have collective decision-making if we accept the outcome of those collective decision-making, but we very easily see that this collective decision will lead to consequences which are extremely endangering the life perspectives of future generations. We need some kind of ideas of priority between those things. And I was wondering how you would construct this kind of priority rules rules or things like that, and how that would be precisely interrelated with the first idea of human dignity as you have laid down it in Principle 1. So I would be glad if you could elaborate this a bit more.
I mean, those are very tough questions, actually. They are tough questions. In my more theoretical writings, and actually tomorrow afternoon, I shall speak at greater length about these principles and the standing of the principles and the justification of the principles. And and that structure of reasoning is quite complex, actually. So I'm not sure how far I should anticipate what I will say tomorrow. But let me just, reflect on a couple of things you said. First of all, I think it's interesting what you say about the inner structure of principles in itself needs to be quite refinedly differentiated. Requires a refined differentiation. I suppose for me, thinking about these principles, many of these principles for me are the principles, in fact, of democratic public life, stripped of the assumption that they can be cashed in bounded territories. So most of the core notions of most of the core principles of democratic autonomy are part of these arguments. So I see, in a sense, these arguments as these principles are the principles that have emerged in part, not metaphysically as it were, but politically in what Rawls calls an overlapping consensus. They are principles of political culture rather than just metaphysical principles. And as such, they are both normative and non-normative in the sense that they are principles that have actually restructured the way we think about what it is that subjectivity and agency means over time. And if you think of the way the struggle for citizenship changed the concept of the subject from one in which the subject was literally the bearer of the rights and duties that were bestowed upon them by a monarch, to the concept of the democratic subjectivity in which citizenship becomes a multiple dimension of autonomy, then these principles, it seems to me, are the requirements, the core requirements of, as you put it, of a fleshed out notion of democratic agency. So I actually think of ways of justifying the principles as involving two steps. First, they require some kind of which I'll speak about tomorrow, some metaphysical meta-principle of autonomy, which is enshrined in the very notion of democratic subjectivity as their overarching structure. And secondly, having got that, it doesn't mean to say just because certain principles constantly emerge, thereby, of course, they're justified. They require a separate kind of justificatory structure. And for me, the justificatory structure that I prefer is what I call the meta-principle of impartialist reasoning. And so I would organize my concept and my conception of the inner differentiation of these principles and their justificatory structures in these two ways. The first set of reflections on the emergence of the concept of democratic subjectivity, which seems to me is spelled out in these principles. And secondly, a concept of justification, which is independent of the emergence of these concepts, but I would spell out in terms of a conception of impartialist reasoning. Now, what order emerges from that? Does any fixed structure of order emerge from that, from thinking about how the principles should be internally prioritized over time? To me, this breaks rather in the direction of a deliberative concept of democracy and a deliberative concept of political processes rather than a simple fixed structure of priorities. In other words, what emerges from this is a way of thinking about politics in deliberative terms, which is bounded by the principles and structures of its own requirements, so that, in other words, it bears conditions of its own possibility in itself, but that how actually these principles of justice and sustainability are articulated will always be indexual or contextual, that is to say, there isn't one fixed structure we have available to us to answer that question theoretically. Rather, we can only answer it politically in context of deliberative discourse at different levels.
Well, certainly nobody needs to come tomorrow, because that was a short version of the
longer version is actually more demanding.
Are you happy with this, or do you want to retort? But maybe it's a good idea if people introduce themselves and have you first, and then
My question is quite a different angle, and I think if somebody wants to...
Yours
if someone wanted to follow up, because I'm really moving from the sublime to the ridiculous. I want you to push that. I'm Christy Slade, and as I'm saying, I'm really not working at this level of theory at all. I have a rather operationalised question here. I'm trying to think about these cosmopolitan citizens and the way they flesh themselves out now. And I was telling some people that last night we had Thomas Kinsella talking, who did the campaign for Obama, the internet campaign for Obama. And that conception, I mean, not many of you might feel as I did, bring on cosmopolitanism when we realised that we weren't able to vote in that election. It was a very clear case where we feel very disempowered. But I think there's a lot of material now about how these new technologies are going to change engagement. Kinsella's vision is very much, the rhetoric is very much that you get people to do things for you, you get them engaged in this campaign. But in fact, behind all of that is someone who was brought up and trained as a direct mail marketer. So there's a whole lot of issues there about the ethics and the practices of these new forms of citizenship. And your envisaged Glaswegian, with the varied forms of commitment, has it pretty easy. I mean, there are just a whole lot of elections going on there. But that's really not what the game is going to be about, even at the national level any longer. So that's my question, as I say.
What is the question? I mean,
well, the question is how are these new technologies going to change what we mean by citizens' engagement? Because I think this last American election has seen a real change, which is actually, as I say, being driven very much by a marketing model, but it has really changed what we think of as the level of engagement that's required.
Well, I think the answer to that is very hard to give, because we don't yet know the full contours of these new technologies. I think we're at the beginning of this technological set of changes, by no means near the end. I think these are the foothills of vast changes in technological and the organizational structure of communications and the possibilities of communications. And from these foothills we can anticipate all sorts of possibilities, but we're not yet close to them. So I think the impact of the internet on politics, and the impact of the internet on communications, and the impact of the internet on citizenship is pretty much in its earliest stages. These are just, 15 years that we have to go on and to reflect on. But having said that, we can clearly now envisage a whole range of processes that were hard to envisage even 15 years ago. For example, we can envisage, cross-border referenda and cross-border information gathering at a speed and efficacy that we couldn't have envisaged 15 years ago. We knew after the war in Iraq started that according to 88 out of 90, within a few days, in 88 out of 90 countries, the population was overwhelmingly regarded that war as illegitimate and illegal. The only two countries excluded from that were the United States and Israel. So it's possible to collect information, to sample opinion now faster and more, and also more subtly as a result of these technologies than it was just a decade or so ago. So on the one hand, of course, the fact that these technologies clearly allows a vaster range of connections between citizens across borders. But that's clearly not all we mean. We also mean the deepening processes of communication and deepening processes of involvement. There are very interesting experiments that are underway in various forms of deliberative democracy, which are seeking to move the idea of opinion away from something that is given and collected and you aggregate into something that is reflective, interactive, and communicative. And these deliberative models of politics and these deliberative models of experiment are about rethinking the nature of citizenship from fixed electoral processes to the dynamic engagement of citizens across issues, in which the issue is not simply the aggregation of citizenship, unreflected opinion, but is in creating a more reflective basis of judgment in citizens themselves. And experiments with this in the domain of deliberative politics have gone quite a long way, as you probably know, from healthcare, juries, all the way through to, citizen involvement in setting, aid budgets and types of aid targets and so on. But even that, having said that, so we can say two things. We can say that from 15 years ago, the impact of the internet and changing forms of communication allows at least three things that didn't exist even 15 years ago. It involves, to use my concepts of in my studies of globalization, it involves a greater extensity of information collection, monitoring and gathering across borders. It allows a much greater intensity of the political process within borders and across borders, and it allows all this to happen much more quickly. The velocity is speeded up as well. But how these three processes of the increasing extensity, intensity and velocity of communication will create an impact on models of citizenship and democracy more broadly is, I think, still at a very early level of engagement and understanding. For example, the Scottish Parliament has built very sophisticated information systems, information gathering, e-governance into its deliberations, but actually there's no evidence yet that much of that input affects much of the output. We know that information gathered, in some international fora around trade negotiations has also been engaged. These communication systems, these new technologies allow vastly greater number of people to participate in the input of trade issues, but actually there's no sense at all that this impacts on how decisions are made at the trade level, at the global level at all. The failure of Denmark to reach a solution is an obvious case in point. So in sum, these new communication patterns that we've seen do allow much more extensity, intensity and velocity of movement of information, reflection and communication. And in interesting hands can yield new concepts of democratic engagement and new concepts of democratic politics. And the best experiments of those, I think, are in the deliberative context and in the deliberative form. However, it's a long way from even that to saying that this yields a new model of democracy at different levels and a new way of thinking about political outputs, the relationship between inputs and outputs. And actually, I think we're going to have a long way to go before we understand what is possible there and before we have clearer models of it. So we can see the promise and we can see the yield and we can see the potential, but the relationship between that potential and structures of power is still very indeterminate, and these technologies can then still be yielded, can still be driven in very many different directions.
My name is Carlos and I'm not from academia.
And you're being punished to be quick. Yeah.
Can you understand me now?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm working on leadership issues, so I'm very much interested, and I'm enjoying myself tremendously this afternoon. Can you say something about the reasons you chose for the concept of governance? Because as I understand it, governance is a bit more indirect than concepts of management, leadership or government.
Yeah.
And obviously you're a very concerned scientist.
Yes.
If you see what I mean.
Yes. The concept of governance is to be distinguished in the first instance from government, because whilst government is the formal taking of decisions within a constitutional structure for a particular state or country, by governance we mean all those rule systems, formal and informal, created by agents, political, economic and social, that impact on the ordering of society, many of which are only dimly related to the process of government itself. You see this, for example, let us say, in some of the very big areas of commercial law and commercial arbitration, that large companies, in the last 15, 20 years, many large, let's take an interesting example, one clear example, by and large American accountancy companies have managed to, across the globe, to standardize the model of accountancy practices on the American conventional model of accountancy. Now, this has had a tremendous impact, for example, in China, because it brings with it a concept of value, profit, balance sheet, a whole range of complex concepts that were at some distance from Chinese culture and Chinese conceptions of economic life. But, so you could say that the whole model of economic thinking around accountancy, led by American accountancy companies, has almost like a coup d'etat, has been accepted across the world, but without any formal reflection, deliberation, and process of whether this is the right or wrong models, as it were, of value to be using. So these companies are able to engineer, in this particular case, a great shift in the governance of economic life, in the rule-making, rule procedures of economic life, with clear impact on the nature and conception of value, quite independently of any process, as it were, of government decisions directly. Okay? So there's an interesting example of how governance has, can be driven by non-state actors, not just economic non-state actors, but by other non-state actors as well. So when I think of governance, I think of an ensemble of rule-making and rule-enforcing processes, actors, agents, institutions, organizations, formal and informal, that include the political formal domain, but stretch way beyond it as well, and yield systems of rules of different kinds, codes of rules of different kinds, which affect and shape the way we live and how we live our lives. So governance is a broader concept, much broader concept than government. And governance, there's governance, as it were, in all realms, in all realms of life, forms of governance, from household, to communities and so on, often which are customary ways of engaging in the regulation of particular sectors or subsystems without direct reference to formal governmental systems.
I understand governance as a concept, having worked in it, but in terms of influence, governance is rather more indirect than concept of leadership or management of government. So why would one choose for an indirect concept instead of a direct concept?
Well, not all forms of governance. Some forms of governance can be, and rule systems can be more consequential than some legal systems, which may be clearly defined and highly formal, and but have limited impact as well. So I think it's an empirical question, as it were, which systems of rules are more efficacious and have more impact and more consequence than others. And it depends entirely on what sector we are looking at. You're looking at the sector, let's say, of AIDS, HIV treatment, or malaria governance, or of, and distinguishing that from other areas, let's say, commercial arbitration rules, or distinguish that from criminal law. They're quite different systems of rule-making and rule enforcement. Some highly formal, enforced by courts, with strict coercive impacts and punishment systems connected to them. Others, much more informal, involving much diversity of actors, but nonetheless highly consequential as well, in terms of who wins, who loses, with what results. Look, take the area of AIDS, HIV management, and the area, for example, of the Global Fund. The Global Fund is a quasi-governmental, intergovernmental organisation. It's actually a tripartite organisation involving governments, private sector, and NGOs, although the main powerful states are the overwhelming authority in global governance, in the Global Fund. But the Global Fund makes decisions about the allocation of funding to drug management programs, to drug programs, which are highly dependent on expert opinion, highly dependent on field advice. And the governance of the Global Fund stands somewhere peculiarly between it. It's not a government arrangement, it's not quite an intergovernmental arrangement, but it's taking highly consequential decisions about who will receive funding for the distribution of antiviral drugs and who doesn't, and under what circumstances this holds. So I would say that's a highly consequential decision procedure, highly consequential rule structure, but doesn't fit neatly into any conventional patterns of formal government or even intergovernmental organizations.
Yes, thank you very much, Sonia Deville. You talk about the power structures represented by the decision makers, following up on the last question, more or less. And on the other hand, the necessity for citizens to engage in dialogue to make cosmopolitanism work. So what about the power structures? Where are they going to be? Would you presuppose a sort of national or rational debate, a sort of public sphere in the Habermasian or post-Habermasian sense that is free of power? How should that work? Where should that start? So I'm wondering, and I'm concerned about the power structures that are still there. How these could be,
There is no one answer for that in a sense. I think there's no one site where discourse and deliberation can take place, especially in a world as complex as ours now. But the idea of an emerging public sphere, which Habermas tracks in Transformation of the Public Sphere, was easier to identify when you have an emerging country, an emerging set of middle classes, and the development of cafe societies which seek to hold decision makers then unaccountable, increasingly accountable to an emergent intelligentsia within the boundaries of a nation state, or emerging, not even nation state, an emerging nation. So the idea of a public sphere is easier to comprehend within the borders of an emerging nation state, because it begins to be that space of debate and discussion that is one way of holding decision makers accountable to decision takers within the public arena. Of course, that becomes much more complex when we go up a level to the regional level, such as the European Union, because one of the striking things, of course, about the European Union is that it is an arrangement, above all, a resettlement of power arrangements from above. The longue durée has been essential in creating the basis for democratic cultures within nation states. And they've taken enormously long periods of time to create and settle the shift from a feudal concept of subjectivity to a contemporary concept of democratic subjectivity. It took 300 or 400 years. And we can't, by extension, we can't ask countries that are not democratic without having had their cultural shifts simply to become democratic. But what happens when you get huge institutional shifts from above, as the European Union represents in the post-1945 era? Where's the obvious public sphere? The striking thing, of course, about Europe is that most of the public spheres that Habermas talks about in Europe are national public spheres. The European public sphere is extremely thin. There were attempts to create cross-border national presence, but they have largely failed. The most significant examples of public spheres within Europe that transcend borders are those represented by the NGOs, often on an issue-based area, around non-governmental bodies of various concerns or social movements with various particular concerns that are able to mobilize those issues across borders quite effectively and constitute a sort of counter-public sphere on the one hand, and the other public sphere, which is also quite sophisticated cross-border as well, is the business public sphere, represented by the Financial Times and Frankfurter Allgemeine, all those newspapers which have a reach, as it were, beyond a limited constituency. So you get, as it were, two emergent regional public spheres at the EU level that are not quite what Habermas meant when he thought of the development of a coherent public sphere, the counter-movement, the counter-sphere of social agents and movements on the one side, tapping into internet organization and mobilization of various kinds, and on the other hand, those elites of business communities, we could say university sectors and so on, that have the mobility, the capacity to mobilize, move, share information, conference, and so on and so forth. So you get partial forms of transnational public spheres. And of course, at the global level as well, this is even more complex and fragmented, but tends to be understood a little bit in sector-by-sector areas. Take, for example, the World Trade Negotiations. The World Trade Negotiations, there is no single global public sphere in which debates about global trade take place. However, that is not to say there are not significant counter-public spheres in which discussion doesn't take place. It does. if you track the emergence of the current trade negotiations at some length, you would see that for a period of time in Doha, when the initial discussions were taking place, Oxfam managed to have a router fitted in somewhere into the information system, so when you clicked onto the official site for Doha, you actually got to the Oxfam site, and not the official site for the trade negotiations. So there is a huge global network of discussion about trade negotiations, quite independent of particular states. And this involves a vast ensemble of peoples. But that vast ensemble of peoples engaged in trade negotiations about states is different from, let's say, feminists and women's movements across the world who mobilize around specific issues to do with population control, to do with population development, birth control, reproductive technologies, and so on. So, long-winded answer is that this is a transitional moment, I think, and we don't yet again know the full contours of it, but clearly there is a shift going on from national discourses of politics and national public spheres to much broader spheres of information and discussion. These are particularly evident in different sectors that are highly pressing on the public agenda: war and peace issues, trade issues, sexual issues, gender issues, and so on. But they don't break around yet any single easily predictable form. Now, I'll only add one last point to that. The idea of a public sphere and the idea of a democratic culture is not something that just comes from below. In a sense, there was no democratic public in those countries that now have democratic publics. Democratic publics is a concept itself that often emerges in response to major changes in reform, major shifts in institutional structure. So, if over time in the 19th century you reflect on Britain, there was no universal democrat. There was no democratic public in the UK in the beginning part of the 19th century. But as the Reform Acts began to take place from 1832 to 1867 and so on, the reform process itself begins to constitute the idea that you are members of a society or a state, not just a taxpayer, but as a voting citizen. So the political process itself reconstitutes the discourse of politics at the same time. Now, in the case of the European Union, the Chicago level, we have what's striking about the European Union is a settlement from above that has not yet created that process. The democratic process is very stillborn and stunted. There is no direct connection, as it were, no direct electoral connection between European representatives that is easily understood. I mean, I would strongly favour, for example, a direct elected European presidency, because that creates a direct connection between people, between a single position that you can understand and comprehend, and the democratic process. The problem with Europe at the moment is that the democratic process is so indirect that they do not create a direct cultural and political connection, or it's only a very indirect one. So this long-winded answer is a way of saying that we are in a process of shifting from a pattern of communication which is national-based to a much more complex regional and global. Sector by sector, these spheres, as they break down, are different and have complex variation. But that does not mean to say they can't be formalised more. And they can be formalised more by procedural and political change from above. And that often can have decisive impacts. The reform of the franchise had a critical impact on the idea of the concept of politics in countries. And I believe the reform of global institutions, if it is done in certain sorts of ways, will create a much closer link between the idea of an individual as a citizen and big global issues too.
I pose the question first, which is to do with the actors on the public spheres. The public sphere within the national sphere, so to speak, traditionally knows individuals as actors as well as organizations. Whereas on the public sphere at a more global level, and the European level is perhaps a good example, is that the actors who engage in debate, in the Anglo-Masculine way, preferably, are not individuals as such, but rather organizations. And perhaps that in the whole concept of organization, there is a building, that may be a building block for a truly global order and a truly global legal order. So maybe a few comments on the idea of organization as a social actor within, debating actor within the public sphere.
Yeah, same context. Since you understand your idea of cosmopolitanism as a kind of explanation what democratic subjectivity means, the relationship between your general principles and the institutions which are realizing them seems to be from crucial importance. But wouldn't that mean that you need at least some kind of ideas what conditions of legitimate relationship between decision-making processes and relevant institutions should look like? So some kind of basic principles about which kind of institution can be legitimate under the underlying principles you developed here. Because up to now you described a picture of shifting of democratic decision-making processes and deliberation, but I think it must be possible to say more to limitate the range of possible legitimate institutions.
Yeah, possibly two questions related to some of what you picked on. But what is this space between national law and international law that you mentioned? And just a sort of, maybe it's a more ontological question, how much of both would you still need to retain the inside and outside boundaries of the sort of the new patterns that are emerging? So it's a kind of inside-outside question. Because, I mean, how far would it extend? Which of the two would be dispensable, for instance, or would neither be dispensable at any point in time? And the second bit is, but that's an old hat and it keeps going around in the family, so to say, the state of communities question, and I still think a lot of it hinges on the unpacking of the idea, because fate is not a problem, so the two issues are separate from the phase of communities need not be problems. But also the idea that has been proposed is that sometimes the argument fate of communities is used to legitimize certain government structures, and I think that's something you might need to somehow answer, because it has a direct impact on issues of responsibility, on democratic legitimacy, and on institutional design. So these are the three areas where I can see it being affected. Just to sort of make it clearer, climate change is a very good example, because from the European perspective, it is of course a global bad and a problem. From the perspective of emerging markets, it is not unequivocally bad. There are winners and losers in this game, and therefore we can maybe talk more of perhaps about a ripple effect, or of different types of climate change problems affecting different parts of the world rather than it being one problem. So just to unpack that a little bit.
These are all legitimate questions, to say the least. Let me start with the second, and go to the first question, and come on to the last question. Your question is about the connection between the principles and institutions, or how one thinks of the movement between the first and the second, such that to what extent do the principles circumscribe the range of legitimate institutions that are possible. In my work, I have tried to approach this in two different ways. I have tried to do it formally in books like Democracy and Global Order, in which I have set out the institutional proposals for one institutional solution to the problem of thinking about the relation between the principles and governance, ultimate governance arrangements. And there I set out the notion of a democratic legal state that could be articulated at different levels bound by these principles. These principles, to the extent that I think of these principles as just a formal elaboration of many of the ideas that the core, for example, of the human rights regime, I am trying to think about ways to strengthen the boundaries between certain values and certain institutional outcomes. So in Democracy in the Global Order, I try to argue that the notion of a democratic legal state, freed of the notion of a state, provides the institutional mechanism for, on the one hand, embedding these core principles, on the other hand, delimiting the range of possible institutional outcomes by a constitutional and legal structure that on the one hand respects these principles, the other operationalizes, and the other ones use these principles as checks on the range of possible institutional outcomes. To me, the idea of a democratic legal state, elaborated in the notion of cosmopolitan democracy, was one such institutional response. However, in my recent work, I tend to think that the defenders of these principles, to the extent that one wants to defend these principles and put them at the heart of democratic politics, what becomes important there is less a reflection on the blueprint of institutional outcomes, and more a reflection on the nature and form of a process consistent with these principles. And in books like Global Covenant, I tended to argue that what follows from these principles is a necessity to create a political space for a new global discussion of the contours of a future institutional settlement, rather than blueprint the institutional settlement itself. So Global Covenant makes the argument and makes an appeal for a new constitutional convention that on the one side defend these principles, but on the other hand leave open the very serious set of issues which follow from an understanding that there is no one institutional solution to this problem, that different countries of different interests will have different ways of thinking about how you get an institutional settlement around the issue. So what matters is the process, as long as it's bound by this principle. So, for example, Global Covenant argues that that the concept of security that has been at the heart of the post-9/11 war, post-9/11 world, was a concept of security largely that comes from one set of nation geopolitical interests that is largely concerned with the protection against terrorism. And what has followed from that in terms of military strategy and coercive politics is a model of doing violence that has largely failed to meet the objectives that initially set out. On the other hand, the concept of security that most of the world concerns about is not that concept of security, but rather survival in everyday life, freedom from immediate need, freedom from famine, freedom from food scarcity, freedom from global infectious diseases, and so on. And that group of countries that support a wider discourse of security also hold some of the keys to thinking about how you could create a bridge between a legitimate concern for protection against terrorism with wider concerns about protection and security in a wider sense. So Global Covenant ends by making a number of institutional recommendations, but only as a contribution to a dialogue about rethinking the nature of security governance, what would be involved in rethinking the nature of security governance, bound by certain common principles. Okay? So what's the emphasis there is less on one institutional analysis and more on one ranging set of political processes. Now, on the question of actors, I think the relationship between individuals and organizations is complex at all levels, whether you're dealing with a city, a nation state, the European Union, or the global level. Because after all, organizations, Oxfam an organization, Save the Children an organization, the Women's Movement an organization. I mean, there are ensembles of individuals acting together around common purposes, the purposes of which are to some varying degrees institutionally embedded, organizationally embedded, and so on. The organizations, whilst they become vehicles for the pursuit of certain collective, individual and collective agendas, only are legitimate and only are successful to the extent that they pursue those agendas effectively and accountably. So that at all levels, it seems to me, that politics is a trade-off between individual engagement and organizational outcomes. I don't think that there is a serious difference of level. The issue of level seriously affects that issue.
Can I make one comment? On the way I see organizations such like Oxfam, that they're not only assemblies of individuals, but they may be the new representative organizations, because so many people who may not support them by money or just be very passive with them, but believe in what they do. So they feel, in a way, represented by what they do, and hence create a basis for legitimate decision making, which is your fourth or fifth principle.
Yes, yeah. But there have always been NGOs. You know, the Anti-Slavery Society in the UK in the 19th century, women's organisations seeking to protect women from illegal abortions. You know, at every level of politics, there's a trade-off between, as it were, activity championed initially by small minorities, developing into movements, organisations, so on. Inside state borders, we call them NGOs, we call them civil society organisations, we call them trade unions, we call them even social movements. Many of those movements at a larger, at a higher level, are exactly the same. So, you know, Oxfam operates globally on a national basis. Every country has more or less an Oxfam in it. What binds Oxfam together as movements is it's an ensemble of national organisations that have a capacity to act internationally and globally as well. But the roots of Oxfam are not just its capacity to represent individuals globally, it's its capacity also to be effective in particular countries. So Médecins Sans Frontières, Oxfam, Save the Children and so on are all nationally based organisations with the capacity to act internationally.
You wish to retort in return?
Sorry about that. Because how I've seen it as well is that these organizations can act, that the way we look at them now is very hierarchical. You have states, because they are organizations as well. You have international organizations like the European Union, which is a vast organization, or the UN even, and you have tiny NGOs, which are organizations. But they all do the same thing. And that's what interests me at the global level. Within the national level, I can understand the hierarchy, because eventually political power lies with voters who vote. They are the true only individuals, of flesh and blood, who can yield political power because they go to the ballot box. That's the big difference. Whereas on the global level, you cannot arrange such a political process of 6 billion people going to the ballot box. You can do it on a different level or a different layer. And organizations like the new, perhaps postmodern organizations like NGOs and the new types of NGOs may fulfill that type of function in creating a decision-making process. On that level, I'm talking about.
Yeah, I understand it, but my view of NGOs is rather similar to my view of corporations and state bodies. That is to say, all are capable of having this organizational impact. All are capable of certain sorts of outcomes, but the fact that they are NGOs alone doesn't guarantee anything that is necessarily noble or wise or representative or accountable. After all, NGOs are an incredibly diverse body of organizations that represent a diverse body of groups. You know, some pro-abortion, some anti-abortion, just to take that one issue alone. So NGOs per se are not necessarily vehicles of increased representation or increased accountability at any level. To the extent that they are, it is because they instantiate, enact, pursue and promote a set of core principles which bind them in some level to become representative, accountable and so on. So what makes, in my argument, the operational capacity of any organisation, social, economic, NGO, non-NGO, corporate or non-corporate, potentially progressive in this way, with an impact that has an enlarging impact, with an enlarging impact on the processes of representation, accountability, fairness, social justice, sustainability, and all of those things, is the extent to which, in their nature and form, operation, and aims, they pursue these principles. That is what demarcates them and allows us to describe them in the way that we're talking about. Nothing inherent in the nature of their operations at all. And the last two questions. What is the space between national and international law, and do I think these spaces are dispensable? Well, clearly, I could become indispensable. Well, I think there clearly is a third space. I mean, national law is clear as a concept. International law is the relation, is the set of rules and regulations created by state through interstate agreements and so on. But there's a sphere of other kinds of laws, other sorts of regulations, human rights regimes, environmental regimes of various kinds, which by their very nature reconstitute the relations in which the other two levels engage. They delimit and circumscribe the nature of power at other levels. They re-describe, re-circumscribe the nature of legitimate authority and legitimate power. So for me, the idea of a human rights regime is a way of describing, even though created by states, re-circumscribes the nature of power and the political process. So I see the sphere, as it were, of cosmopolitan law as setting down those rules of autonomy, democracy, accountability, justice, sustainability that create a sphere of engagement in and through which national law and international law can then take place. Setting down parameters for legitimate political power.
Yeah, I guess that does this need to be other spheres to be I mean, you said they were constituted by the others, but do they still require it as a sort of as a continuous process? Does cosmopolitan law require the other two spheres to remain intact?
Well, to the extent that constitutional law sets down rules of coexistence, certain kinds of phenomena, rules of coexistence, it still leaves vast areas of regulation and politics that will go on. So in that sense, I can't. My conception of cosmopolitanism is not a conception of federalism or of global federalism. It's rather a way of thinking about creating an international global legal community which circumscribes the range of forms of engagement in and through which political life unfolds. We already have that partially, and that's the crucial thing that I try and argue, that the law of war, for example, and human rights law, among other forms of law, constitute stepping stones towards universal constitutional order. And those stepping stones towards universal constitutional order already have elements, to the extent that they are effective, of circumscribing political power in new ways, rechiseling and refashioning, for example, recasting the notion of legitimate sovereignty, for example. So I think that to the extent that this is not a federalist conception of power and politics, but rather that of the international legal community or global legal community, then the other levels, and many other levels besides, will still, of course, will still be efficacious, significant, important areas of political mobilization, conflict and struggle. So I do not think in the establishment of a cosmopolitan legal framework, that's the end of local politics, regional politics, state-based politics, and so on. But the terms of reference of those political systems change and alter as a result of moving in this direction, as they do already within the European Union, as they do already within the sphere of international law, and as they do already in other ways as well. Now, to come to your question of the community of fate and the overlapping community, can I actually come to that? We know each other very well, and we don't agree on anything, so on this particular concept of the community of fate to international fate, I think the conventional or the orthodox form of political theory, especially in the 18th and 19th century, within the area of democratic politics, was to try and articulate a concept of accountability of rulemakers to those who are affected by rules, which assumed a symmetry and congruence in the relationship between decision makers and decision takers. The whole of democratic theory, by and large, has taken for granted the borders of states, the boundaries and territorial units of states, as the key and basic constituency of decision-making and legitimate decision-making. So democratic theory in all its guises, from early Lockean ideas through John Stuart Mill and to 20th century democratic theorists, has seen at its core the key problem is this: how to establish legitimate democratic governance, how to establish democratic legitimacy, how to establish forms of democratic political justice within the boundaries of something called the political community. Because the political community was the core relevant unit of concern, assumed. It is where power lay, it is where crucial political decisions were made, it is where fate of citizens is largely set down and determined. But from the 18th to 19th century, this is my argument, as you know, to present day, increasingly the decisions of certain states have impacted on others in which the citizens are disenfranchised. Processes occur, like the choice of certain kinds of energy systems, which have consequences for others. Decisions are made in agricultural systems in one country that have consequences for the life chances of peoples in other countries, and so on and so on and so on. So the problem is not how the problem of a democracy and accountability shifts from solving the problem of symmetry and congruence within bounded territories to something far more spatially diffuse and complex. And that's what I try and capture with this notion of overlapping communities of faith, which means that the fate and fortunes of countries are increasingly entwined in area after area after area, from financial decision-making to environment to all sorts of other things. So, for me, the political problem shifts, and the theoretical problem of political theory has to shift with it. The old assumptions of symmetry and congruence in the bounded territory no longer do the job of specifying what the problem of accountability and rulemaking is. If we live in a world increasingly overlapping communities of faith, not just politically, but socially, economically, environmentally, and so on, if that's true, then the relationship between stakeholders, decision makers and stakeholders, inputs and outputs of the political process becomes far more complex. And if that's true, then the problem for political theory is no longer the problem of sovereignty, no longer the problem of rightful authority within the bounded state, no longer the problem of legitimate democratic processes within territorially unreflected processes. The problem becomes different. The challenge to political theory shifts, a paradigmatic shift in the nature and form of political theory to a different set of questions. That is, how do you ensure democratic outcomes and processes in fluid forms of power systems which may not reflect any longer the settled forms and boundaries of the state system? To the extent that this is true, then democracy and the notion of a democratic legal state has to shift from the bounded state structures of the nation state to more complex regional and global processes and networks. And my argument is that there will not be one body that can do this. There will be no one federal structure that will win consent and support. But to the extent that political power operates within the framework of these principles, these cosmopolitan democratic principles, then we can say that power remains democratic and can operate democratically in diverse forms, formally and informally, locally, supranationally, and so on.